Donetsk today, the city in Ukraine and a heartland of Russian industry, which was once John Hughes' town of Hughesovka, the city which has been a microcosm of the history of Russia. In this city, they start a new school year. A new term in a new year in what they hope will be a new Russia. In 1917 here, in what was once Hughesovka, there was a hard and bloody struggle for a new Russia. Soviets of workers mushroomed all around Hughesovka. In the nearby village of Rudchenkova, Nikita Khrushchev started on his career. He ordered the arrest of the police and the formation of a workers' militia. But it took the Bolsheviks months to get a grip on Hughesovka itself. But as the country slithered into civil war, Hughesovka came to a stop. Helen Waring was born in Hughesovka, the daughter of a British engineer and a Russian mother.
When all the British people went away, I just lived permanently with my grandparents, and when I was about 7, I had to start going to school. When I went to school, I enjoyed it, although I could read and write, and there were just village children who could hardly know their alphabet. In winter one day, one of the boys called my grandfather bourgeois, which was a sort of a swear word in those days, and I had a fight with him. And after that, I couldn't go back to school again. My grandparents would let me go again.
Helen Waring grew up during the ferocious civil war which started in 1918 and killed 14 million people. In the Ukraine, there were white armies, red armies, Ukrainian nationalists, German puppets and private armies, like the anarchists of Makhno.
Civil war was quite a great experience because in that particular area, the White Army and the Russian Army were fighting all the time. And one army would come in and occupy the town, and then the Reds would come and chase them out and occupy the village, and that happened, I don't know how many times, but 12, 13 times. And the Civil War was all around us. The officers were billeted in our house, whatever army was in occupation, and they were quite nice. I mean, they did give no trouble at all. But of course we had a lot of bandits coming in and out, the deserters from both armies. And well, they're completely different. They just took everything they could lay their hands on. But one particular occasion I certainly remember, because they came in and demanded from our servant some food. And she said we had none left in the house, so they pushed her against the wall and threatened to kill her. And I was standing in the doorway and I could see it all. It was pretty horrible. But Mother sort of begged them to leave her alone. She'd take everything from the house to leave her alone. And then they just suddenly disappeared.
By 1921, the Civil War was over, but then famine had them by the throat.
We were very short of everything. The beggars came to the house quite often, and then we had to go shopping sometimes to get our bread ration, and you could see people sitting at the roadside begging for bread. And yes, it was pretty horrible because they came from all over Russia to Ukraine, because Ukraine comparatively was a richer country than the rest of the Russia. And people thought if they came there, they would get enough food. But even Ukrainians were starving at that time.
Men were dropping dead from starvation in the steelworks. The Communist Party sent in its militants. It organized a labor army with its own newspaper, the Dictatorship of Labor.
In the Republic of Labour, there is no room for parasites and idlers. They will either be shot or pulverized between the great millstones of labour.
thousands of people poured into the Donbass, mobilized civilians and volunteers. And workers, miners in particular, were built into a privileged elite. They were paid more than anybody else and had real powers in their pits and steelworks. The more coal a miner produced, the more bread he got. Among those who came flooding in was an enthusiastic young teacher, Julian Feldjorovich Schmilo.
И вот таким я энтузиастом приехал сюда. Приехал я энтузиазм вот так. Понимаете, все охватить. Вижу, что много делать, да. Вот, командирование для восстановления Донбасса во всех профилях. Восстановление металлургии, восстановление горного хозяйства, восстановление образования.
In these desperate circumstances, Lenin launched the new economic policy, NEP, which restored much free enterprise in the country and in internal trade.
Так вот, когда я приехал сюда, в Донбасс, я был поражен изобилием продуктов. Жизнь вот такая материальная ничего не стоила почти.
The steelworks were slow to respond, but by 1923, the coal pits were producing half their pre-war output. Hughesovka crawled back to a population of 32,000. Houses of culture were built. Piped water was laid on for the first time. The railway was extended. Cinemas opened and the first radio station.
They wanted to open a club for the working people. It was middle of winter, and we were just put out of the house. All the furniture was removed and put out in the yard in the snow. And we just had to keep on trying to find a place. And we were lucky, we lost a bit of furniture, but we found a room eventually in another large house. But later on, when we knew that Khrushchev was in charge of the village Soviet, we always suspected that it may have been by his orders that we were moved out of our house. But I've forgiven him. I always liked Mr. Khrushchev.
Everywhere, the old had to give way to the new. And in the next year, Hughesovka changed its name. It could hardly go on calling itself after a foreign capitalist. At first, the Bolsheviks named the place after Trotsky, organizer of the Red Army and hero of the Civil War. Not much sign of him in this museum. But early in 1924, Lenin died, and Trotsky was driven into the margins by a new troika led by Zinoviev, Kamenev, and the party secretary Stalin. Stalin was then a shadowy figure. The party activists loved him, but he was little known. Then in June 1924, Hughesovka renamed itself Stalino. It was the first town in the Soviet Union to give itself the name borne by Joseph Stalin, though there's not much sign of him here either. It is widely assumed that the town was named after him. This is not the case. The word Stalin simply means steel. And after their unfortunate experience with Trotsky, the rulers of Hughesovka settled on a nice, safe, neutral name, Steel Town. Of course, in a couple of years' time, they must have discovered that their choice had been singularly prudent. And it was as Stalino that John Hughes' old town entered its heroic age. By 1926, the population had reached 174,000. It produced more coal than it had ever done. The finest engineers working with masses of people who were little more than clumsy apprentices. But after a few years of well-being, NEP started to break down. In the late 1920s, peasants weren't delivering enough grain. Heavy industry was in a mess. There was talk of war. Stalin, now rapidly building up his power in the party and turning it on his opponents, decided a new heroic age was necessary.
The Western powers took 100 years to industrialize. We must catch up with the West in 10 years.
This struck the resonant frequency of communists. But what sort of communists were these? Most of the original communists had been destroyed or dispersed. Waves of new people came in, idealists, careerists, half-educated peasants, weeded out in repeated purges. Many didn't have a clue about Marxism, communism, socialism, about what their leaders were arguing about. But ferociously energetic and ambitious, they wanted to do something and to be somebody. And for those who were truly dedicated, the strain was unbearable.
Of all deaths of Communist Party members this year, 14% have been suicides. Only 10% are healthy. A third have tuberculosis. A third have shattered nervous systems.
These people were trying to create communism without communists. What they created was Stalinism and Stalinists, and Stalino was a prime center of production. From 1928, Stalin, moving to total power, hurled Soviet Russia into 5 astonishing and appalling years without precedent in modern history. He launched a titanic program of crash industrialization. Within 5 years, 30 million people were on the move in a Russia which, overnight, had become an urban country. The impact on Stalino was shattering. Overcrowding became a permanent Soviet condition. Helen Waring's family had to move all over again.
They had to move because a lot of industrial development was going on in Hughesovka, and they didn't have any accommodation for the workmen. So they occupied the big houses again, they built bunks for the workmen, and the people who lived there just had to find other living accommodation.
Production rocketed, so did the accident rate. These were the highest paid workers, and they were drenched in the rhetoric of building socialism, but every trace of socialism vanished. There was dictatorial management. Trade unions became transmission belts for a state power which was swallowing society. Endless speed-ups, 3-shift working, internal passports. It ran into absenteeism, wildcat strikes, mass drunkenness, countered by beatings, arrests, executions, the growth of the gulag. There was a swelling hatred of specialists and their privileges, and Stalin rode it. Maria Kravchuk's husband was head of his section.
Хорошо, премии часто были, все было хорошо. А потом, когда стало вот этот сталинизм, да, его из партии исключили, с работы сняли, мастером послали, понимаете? А мы жили в 40-квартирном доме, большой дом, ИТРовский. И то устанешь, того уже посадили, того и директора посадили, и всех посадили. И думаю, папа приехал. Что такое? Нет писем, ни от вас нету ничего. А он мне говорит, не говори родителям.
A wave of workerism broke across the country. Everyone who wasn't a worker was excluded from the hundreds of technical colleges and universities which mushroomed overnight to churn out thousands of graduates and to set millions of families on their upward march out of poverty and squalid ignorance.
We all had to do some social work. Each one of us was allotted a person to teach to read and write, because it was important that everybody knew how to do it.
And in this turmoil, Stalino was caught in the backlash of Stalin's war against the peasants. The mass collectivization of agriculture plunged the country districts into a virtual war. Hundreds of thousands were killed or died of starvation as millions were deported. As the peasants slaughtered their cattle and food supplies plummeted, Stalin cruelly refused to import grain. He tried to rake every ounce out of an exhausted country. Here in the Ukraine, there was a relentless assault on national identity, the intellectuals, and the church. the Baptists, here in Donetsk in full resurrection now, were pursued with a peculiar savagery and almost wiped out. In Stalino, they closed the Roman Catholic Church, they handed the Armenian Church over to a workers' club, and here they destroyed the cathedral which John Hughes had built and replaced it with a cinema in the classical style. Culture, they said, had triumphed over superstition. And in the countryside, 5 million people were left to die of starvation.
Каждый вечер я жил возле трассы, куда идет кладбище. Каждый вечер везли людей, сложенных вот так, и там их закапывали. Они были без роду, без племени, они пришли были, понимаете. За них никто не беспокоился, где их похоронить. О них и забыли, да. Они умерли, и было даже людоедство было. Морили голодом, голодомор, это было, да.
At long last, in 1934, the pressure eased off. In a Soviet Russia which had been transformed, policies were reversed, new hierarchies of power and privilege formed. As industry moved into more measured gear, new machinery was installed, new housing rose. Helen Waring's grandfather got electricity and water laid on for the first time in his life. And as Stalino grew at breakneck pace, back in John Hughes' homeland, South Wales was devastated by the Depression. Thousands of people there looked to the Soviet Union as a beacon of hope, as I did myself. We knew little or nothing of the repression. We knew of the sacrifices. We saw them as the price paid by a heroic people building a new social order. Stalino was one of the pillars of that new order. In the 30s, it became a great industrial city of 500,000 people. It was as much of an ecological disaster as South Wales. Life and work were hard and often dangerous as these pits dug deeper and deeper. But by the end of the 30s, there is some sense of a people entering an inheritance. Stability, however, they were not to find. When a Donbass miner, Stakhanov, broke all coal-cutting records, the Stalinists, with their taste for the epic spectacular, made him a hero. For several years, Stakhanovism, with its endless drive, its rewards, its privileges, cut across workers' backs like a whip. It drove both managers and workers crazy, as today's miners well understand.
Во-первых, ведь стакановское движение как такового, это было... Ну, те шахтеры, которые работали, не верили тому, что так было возможно работать.
Я не занижаю там достоинств Стаханова, но рядом со Стахановым были, по-моему, такие же, которые делали ему славу, но они остались в тени.
And in this Stakhanovite climate, Stalin unleashed his great terror between 1937 and 1939. Today's KGB of Glasnost lists 1 million official executions. Many, many more died without benefit of Stalinist clergy. At least 18 million people passed through the Gulag. God knows how many perished. The old Communist Party was destroyed. 2 whole waves of new Stalinists destroyed after it. The terror moved outwards in ever-expanding circles through the party, the state apparatus, the managerial and intellectual classes. In the end, it seemed to feed on itself in murderous lunacy. What it left was a ruling class of survivors.
Сталинский период, это висит дамоклов меч. Вот выживу или нет. Я жил в городе, и каждый день почти пробегала машина такая, называется «Черный ворон». Слышали? И смотрим, куда она заедет. Вот туда заехала, взяли человека, кончено. Не кончено, взяли человека и туда. Вот этот человек мой, друг Илюшенко, это, я бы сказал, был эталон коммуниста, это образец ленинца, понимаете. Приехали, и вот в день рождения его сына, его забрали, позвали на 5 минут. И приехал он через 19 лет, и он вернулся оттуда.
But workers and ordinary people were rarely touched themselves. On the contrary, the systematic decimation of their rulers opened up society to them. Equally real was the upward surge of millions of people into a fuller life. In urban, working-class Russia, Stalin, now towering over all like one of Marx's Oriental despots, became a hero. Workers like Maria Osipenko certainly remember him.
Хорошо. Но не так, как при... Кто у нас? Горбачев? Горбачев повел. При Сталине жили хорошо.
She says things were fine under Stalin. Coexisting with the terror in a manner many of us find hard to grasp were the millions of people who believed they were building a new and splendid world. And it was this which captured the imagination of millions outside under the threat of fascism and brought pilgrims to the new Holy Land, many of them from the homeland of John Hughes and myself. It was at that time that my youthful imagination was captured by the Spanish Civil War, and I joined the Communist Party. This is Lenin, founder of the Communist Party. In Donetsk today, people still respect Lenin, but they have turned their backs on the party. In the 30s, I, like thousands of others, joined the party in the spirit of the Popular Front against fascism. And it was that spirit which was betrayed by the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939. Comrade Molotov shakes hands with that bloody butcher of the workers, von Ribbentrop. The Nazi-Soviet Pact, typical of Stalin, a cold-blooded maneuver which blew up in his face. The net effect, in appallingly short order, was to expose the Soviet Union to the unbridled power of the mightiest and most vicious war machine in Europe. In 1970, the Soviets made a film about Stalino during the war. Not a word about that suicidal pact.
И еще они очень гордились своим Донбассом. Вот каким стал старый Обушковый край. И никто не мог знать, что внезапно и вероломно в этом миру светлом небе появится тень фашистских стервятников с черными крестами, и что сбросят они смертоносный груз на гордость человеческого труда.
The German armies crossed the border on the 22nd of June 1941. During 2 years of his terror, Stalin had shot more Red Army officers than Hitler killed in the first 2 years of this terrible war, and the first months were a total disaster. The Germans were in Stalino on the 21st October. They dropped parachutists right into the steelworks, but they were too late. The people scorched their own earth. They wrecked the works, flooded the pits. Young communists and miners put up a heroic last stand. The Germans took the survivors and threw hundreds of them to their deaths down the mine shafts. Many country people in the Ukraine, some in the city, welcomed the Nazis as liberators. Some fought alongside them to the end. But most were soon sickened by the Nazi regime, with its deportations, forced labor, its atrocious butchery of subhuman Slavs along with subhuman Jews. In their characteristic style, the Nazis took the central house of culture, which stood here, and turned it into a prison camp. God knows how many people died there. Some say as many as 250,000. Those people are remembered. Here the eternal flame burns in their memory. But throughout their 2 years of occupation, the Germans got not a single ton of coal or steel out of Stalino. The Germans claimed otherwise. This Nazi film is a phony as that workman wielding his peculiarly flaccid sledgehammer.
In den riesigen Werkanlagen wird die Produktion ständig gesteigert. Schichtwechsel in einem Kohlenbergwerk. Ukrainische Bergarbeiter.
The nightmare ended on the 8th September 1943, a moment commemorated here. The Red Army, sweeping west, returned to Stalino. Another sort of nightmare began. The city and its mines were in ruins. So dreadful had been the losses that for many years there were 12 women for every man. It was women who did the work. Until 1959, it was women who worked the pits. "75 years had passed since John Hughes came to these steps. Hundreds of thousands of people had come to the town he created and made it their home. For many of those people, many of those years were years of suffering. Now, they had to rebuild the place all over again.